Buenas tardes a todos. Y una vez más, bienvenidos y bienvenidas a nuestro viaje al silencio, al corazón del silencio, no el corazón de las tinieblas, sino el corazón del silencio. Entramos ya en nuestra cuarta fase de este viaje, breve pero intenso, creo yo, muy fecundo. Y quiero comenzar con una confesión, y es que la idea de este ciclo de conferencias comenzó con la lectura de un libro que tiene el mismo título que el ciclo, Viaje al silencio, que lo tengo aquí físicamente, escrito por Sara Maitland, aquí entre nosotros. Un libro preciosamente editado por Alba, como nos tiene acostumbrados. Y antes de nada, quiero deciros que es un libro extraordinario, que aquí tenemos el lujo de tener a su autora, que ha venido desde Escocia especialmente para estar con nosotros. Así que bienvenida, Sara, y gracias por haber venido a estar aquí con todos nosotros, ¿no? La verdad es que este es uno de los libros que cuando se concluye la lectura, al menos a mí me pasó así, me dije a mí mismo, este libro me habría gustado escribirlo a mí. Y lo digo porque, aunque sea un ensayo, pues tiene la vivacidad de las novelas, de las buenas novelas, y por ello, en cuanto terminé su lectura, me preocupé de ponerme en contacto con la autora para felicitarla personalmente, ¿no? Sara relata en este libro su experiencia de una mujer fascinada, literalmente fascinada, atrapada por la magia del silencio. Una mujer, lo vais a ver en cuanto la escuchéis, seguramente ya lo estáis viendo por su presencia, por lo que irradia su presencia, una mujer valiente que, ni corta ni perezosa, decidió ir en busca del silencio. De modo que si otros días reflexionábamos sobre el silencio en la meditación, reflexionábamos sobre el silencio en la poesía, hoy vamos a tener con nosotros a una persona que ha hecho la aventura física de desplazarse por todo su país buscando lugares silenciosos para experimentar qué es lo que se experimentaba ahí, en esos lugares. Es un libro con reflexiones ajustadísimas, con intuiciones fulgurantes. Yo creo que es un regalo para el lector. Esta mañana me comentaba cuando llegaba a Chamartín, porque ha venido desde París en tren, no le gustan los aviones a Sara, me comentaba pues, que ha habido más de 40.000 ventas de este libro en su país, que ha sido traducido a muchas lenguas, que estaba muy contenta de cómo el silencio quizá sea el tema de nuestro tiempo. También por la afluencia a este ciclo podríamos decir algo así, ¿no? Antes de darle la palabra, que supongo que estaréis impacientes por escucharla, pues quiero decir alguna palabra también sobre su biografía, como siempre hacemos, ¿no? Sara Maitland creció en Londres y en el suroeste de Escocia. Fue a la Universidad de Oxford en 1968 y allí estudió inglés y, lo que es más importante para ella, allí fue donde descubrió el feminismo, el socialismo, el cristianismo y la amistad, que para ella han sido piedras de toque en su vida. Estos 4 pilares: feminismo, socialismo, cristianismo y amistad. Y de la lectura de este libro se puede deducir claramente que, evidentemente, estos son pilares para ella en su vida. Con su primera novela, porque además de ensayista es novelista, la primera novela se titulaba La hija de Jerusalén, ganó en 1978 el premio Somerset Maugham y desde entonces vive y se ha considerado en su país como una escritora, ¿no? Escribe sobre mujeres y utiliza con frecuencia historias de diversas tradiciones, tales como cuentos de hadas, leyendas, mitos, cuentos populares. Los cuentos dice que son su género favorito. Y hace 2 o 3 años, pues guiada por esta fascinación del silencio, se construyó una pequeña casa en un páramo salvaje en el norte de Galloway. La búsqueda del lugar de esta casa y cómo se la construyó, pues lo relata en parte en este libro. He leído en su página, creo, en su blog, no sé, que sus vecinos más cercanos en esta casa es una familia de lechuzas, y con esta compañía de las lechuzas, Sara, casi una ermitaña, podríamos decir, se dedica a sus 3 actividades favoritas, que son escribir, orar y caminar. Y dice que es feliz. Una confesión seguramente bastante rara en nuestros contemporáneos, ¿no? Edwin Muir describe así el páramo donde vive Sara. Os leo un par de frases. Durante unas 20 millas recuerdo haber visto solo 2 casas. No había ahí señal de vida alguna, a excepción de unas cuantas ovejas a lo lejos, mordisqueando algunos mechones. Ni siquiera las aves parece que vayan por allí, y el único sonido que oí fue el de una alondra que cantaba en lo alto. Queremos que Sara, que además se define como católica, comprometida y fumadora empedernida, buen binomio, nos hable de todo esto. Así que, querida Sara, introdúcenos un poco, si quieres, en tu particular y fascinante viaje al silencio.
And I'll never know what he said. I hope it was nice. It's very nice to be here. I'm really grateful, actually, to Pablo and to the and to MAPFRE for inviting me. And yeah, it's really nice. It's particularly nice because I don't go out very often, but I'm here partly because I was asked in a very enthusiastic way, and partly because my daughter's getting married, so I've got to get some money to buy a hat. We rather raised the level of hats for weddings in Britain last week. I'm going to... The book is, as the Spanish title makes clear, a story of a journey that I've made over the last just a bit more than 10 years now. And I'm really just going to talk a little bit about that and a little bit about why. From the bits I could understand of what Pablo said, which wasn't much, I think he said a bit about my very noisy childhood, and then I come from this very, very large family, and we shout all the time. My son's partner, the first time she met my family, she said afterwards it was the most frightening thing that she'd ever done in her life. And I said, why? And she said, because I couldn't believe that people who talked so much, so loudly and so rudely weren't going to hit each other. And that's pretty much how it was. And then I was married and I had 2 children who are lovely. And then for a whole lot of reasons, which I'm not going to go into now, not now at the moment, in the 90s, I found myself in quite a new place. My marriage ended, I'm sad to say, and my children grew up, as they do, and went off to do the things they do. My daughter, the one that's getting married, is an actress, and she went to New York at about that time for work reasons and has never come back again. And my son went off to university at the very end of the 90s. So then really, for the first time in, a long time, I thought, now I can do anything I want to do. And I had to think what I wanted to do. And what I wanted to do initially was to find out a bit more about silence, because partly I'd been having more of it. I'd moved out of London, was living in a little cottage quite near London, and I had a garden for the first time in my life, and I was on my own for the first time in my life. And I found how much I liked that, and I was very curious about it. Originally, I was just very curious about it. And so I started to read about silence, about people writing about silence, and one of the things I read was from one of the Desert Fathers, the 3rd century Christians who went into the desert beyond Egypt, led by St. Anthony originally, and formed this enormous community of hermits, really. The funny thing about these hermits is most of them couldn't write, so everything we know about them is because they said it. So their silence is of a rather strange nature. And in English, their the collection of their documents is actually called The Sayings of the Desert Fathers. And at one level, all you could say is they ran around telling each other that they ought to be quiet. But they also, I think, were forging a very new, for their time, new and powerful form of spirituality, which wasn't just about being silent. It was about going beyond, going out into the desert, going beyond the normal limits of self-discipline and restriction. And one of the things I read was by was one of their sayings, and it went like this. One of the monks came to Abba Joseph and said to him, "Father, according to my strength, I keep a rule of prayer and fasting and meditation and quiet. And according to my strength, I purge my imagination. What more could I do?" And the old man, standing up, held his hand against the sky, and his fingers became like 10 torches of fire. And he said, "If you will, you can be made wholly aflame." So I thought it would be rather nice to be made wholly aflame. A kind of intensity of inner experience. So I initially just started out to look at how that might work and where you might do it and why it might be interesting. And the first thing I did was to explore, not all, because there are a lot, but many of the places in which silence has happened, which are always rather extreme. The only place that I can find that does not have, the only extreme landscape that I can find that does not have a tradition of silence is jungles. And I went to the Amazonian jungle to test that out, and jungles are about the noisiest places in the world. They are very, very noisy, mostly because thousands of insects are buzzing all the time, different tones. But other than that, the hermits and silence seeking, I was trying to look not just at religious silence, but at any groups of people who'd sought silence. And one place I didn't go because I don't have the ability to go, which was really a pity, was out to sea, because some of the most interesting accounts of silence and solitude are from solo sailors. And they're interesting accounts because solo sailors have to keep a logbook, because you have to, if you're sailing, you have to know where you are. So you have to keep a logbook. And that very quickly develops into a kind of personal journal. Whereas if you're climbing up vertical mountains, it's not very handy to note down your impressions as you kind of go. But I didn't do that. But I did go to some islands, some very small islands. And when I went to small islands, I realized that there is a big subjective element in silence, because I thought that islands were unbelievably noisy. They have a lot of birds on them who make an awful lot of noise. And then they have this sea that goes lap, 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 when it isn't going splash, 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 or roar, roar, roar. But interestingly, in the early days in the north, islands were what monks preferred. I don't know if that's true. In southern Europe, you've probably got fewer handy islands than we have up the northwest. But for whatever reasons, these monks are always going after islands, and I went to some islands, and I thought, that's not for me. The other reason I discovered it wasn't for me is, for me, silence became very much associated with big spaces, and islands always have a limited space. So at one point I thought I'd go and live on some islands. In fact, at one point I nearly persuaded my brother-in-law that he wanted to buy an island, but for me. I wasn't going to get it forever, it was a deal. But unfortunately, my sister said if he bought an island, she was divorcing him. So on consideration, he didn't. which is lucky because it turned out islands weren't any good at all anyway, for me. And then I went up some mountains because in the 19th century, the poets and artists of both Germany and Britain were completely in love with mountains. They thought mountains were it, really. And they were always going up mountains and writing poems about it, essentially. But there was something about those very high, silent places that excited them. But so I did try quite a lot of mountains. And of course there were good things. And then I also looked at people who were silent in cities, which is quite a famous tradition. But I couldn't do it because essentially I'm a terribly sociable person. So if there was anybody for me to talk to, I knew I'd be talking. I also tried some forests, some woods, which were wonderfully silent and very, very beautiful, but they frightened me. And in the book I talk quite a lot about why they frightened me. And the funny thing is that just now, writing about it, I stopped being frightened of them, and now I'm writing a new book about forests. But in this book, I just was really frightened by the forests. Not frightened, that's too big a word. We have a word scared in English, which means frightened but not very. So like little kids are scared at night. Frightened would be really horrid, but scared, I find forests really scary. So what I really came to realise is that the silent landscape is different for everybody. It's different. And the more I read about it, I read a very beautiful story about St. Anthony, who was a hermit for a very, very long time. And first of all, he did it for some reason in a ruined fort. I haven't worked that out yet in Egypt. And then he spent another 20 years teaching people how to be silent, really. And then when he was very old, he went off with some Bedouin traders across the desert, and he arrived at this place, and there's the most lovely account of it, that when he saw it, he was so happy that he ran round and round in small circles crying. And he just recognised in that something that was for him. When I went to the desert, which is just unbelievable, I love the desert, and I now go each year. I lead a little expedition to the desert. The desert is the most silent place, but I was 50 years old, and I thought, I can't do this. It was too big, it was too much. So I decided that I'd have to find a silent place that was in Britain. Just the management of going serious deserting was too much for me. And then in 2005, I was, in the summer of 2005, my mother died. Which, being my mother, she managed to do in spectacular style. Sorry, that's not quite fair to her. She was very, very good at it. She had all of us kind of gathered around her deathbed about 6 times in 4 months. And just at the point we all thought, here we go again. She most unfortunately died. And my mother not only had 6 children, she had over 20 grandchildren. And she managed to get them all there the week before she died. It was really rather exhausting for the rest of us. No, that's not quite fair, but that... Anyway, after that, I thought I really had to get settled down and find a place to live. And I was driving up a little road one day for no very good reason when I was on my own, and I just thought to myself, I have to live in this valley. It's where and unfortunately, there weren't any houses in it, so I had to build one, but that's a slightly other story. It's what we called in Britain, we called moor, which is very high land, but not very hilly. It's sort of high and flat, and it has nothing in it. Nothing grows there. A few sheep. You can't grow any crops. There are very few trees, because it's just this hopeless rock and peat land. There's quite a lot of it in northern Scotland, but my little bit was in southern Scotland, which is better because no tourists ever go there. Nobody ever goes where I live. When I first showed one of my sisters the house, she said, well, Sarah, nobody's going to just drop by, are they? Because you have to go about 8 miles up this little single-track road to get there. So I built a house there, and I moved into it in 2007, really. And since then, I've been, until this year, been trying to see what happens if you live as silently as possible. And I wrote the book because I think quite a lot of very interesting things do happen, both things that happen to me and things that happen to other people who are silent. I'm not going to talk about all those things today, but I know at a sort of one level that I am a great deal calmer and a great deal happier than I have been, certainly in 40 years. And I think it's because of never being in a hurry, because there's nothing to hurry for. I mean, it's just as simple as that. If nothing's happening, the most exciting thing that happens is a sheep comes past. It's not very demanding, really. I'm happy because if you build a house yourself, you can have it exactly how you like it. And I designed my house. I didn't build it all myself, I should say. I had some help I employed some people who knew how to do it, which was probably a good idea. And they were very nice. And should you ever consider building a house, pick one in a very inconvenient place because your workmen want to get finished. I don't know how it is in Spain, but in Britain at least, builders are famous for not ever finishing the job. They arrive with great energy on week 1, they work for 3 days, and then you actually know they're doing the first 2 days of everybody else's job in a never-ending circle, but perhaps Spanish workmen are wonderful. British ones aren't. But here, it was such a bore to get there that they come very quickly and work terribly hard and stay all night so they could get away. So that's just a hint for the future. It doesn't have much to do with silence. So once I was there, or even actually before I got there, I started thinking what you had to do to have a more silent life. And some of it's obvious. Get rid of the television. It's the most important hint. And the second one is get rid of your mobile phone. Now, I'm actually rather advantaged on that one because where I live, there is no mobile phone access. So it's not quite as wonderful as it sounds, but it's good. There's in the Middle Ages, the scholastic theologians spent a lot of time trying to work out what the devil's plan might be, what the kind of master plan from hell was. And they concluded that what the devil was really trying to do was to get into the position where nobody was ever alone with their God and nobody was ever genuinely engaged one-to-one with another human being. Endless distraction is what they wanted. But these scholastics were very much reassured because they said the devil had no imagination and couldn't create any new thing. So since they could see there was nothing that would allow the devil quite to pull this off, they were safe. But over the next 1,500 years, the devil got this really smart idea, and it's called the mobile phone. If you think about it, if you've got a mobile phone in your pocket, you are never completely alone, and you are never eye to eye with one other person. They are the most extraordinarily cunning devices, which doesn't mean they're not immensely useful and immensely important and do a lot, I think, to keep our children safe and to enable certain sorts of working patterns. One of my brothers, who's a farmer, says that nowadays you have to choose between being a farmer in a field and a farmer in an office, and a mobile phone makes it possible for him to go on being a farmer in a field. So I'm not sort of really opposed to them, but I think in Luxembourg, I don't know why, in Luxembourg, 115% of people own a mobile phone. And that includes all the newborn babies and all the, that is bizarre. We're not quite that high in Britain yet, but jolly nearly. I mean, you may need one mobile phone, but nobody can possibly need two. And for me, the mobile phone and the shopping mall have come to represent the bombardment of noise that we've started to feel, not that we like, but that we need. That we need this endless communicate. We need, I honestly believe, a dangerously high stimulus. If you put particularly young people, but old people too, grown-ups too, into very silent places where they cannot make contact with another human being, they start to go mad. They get very, very restless, very, very high anxiety levels. It's not very, very good for your health either, actually, but we won't go down there. That we live in a culture that has become frightened of silence. So quite a lot of what I've been trying to do is trying to understand what that fear is. Because it seems to me if you can't be silent with yourself, then you cannot really freely, properly love another person. If you need, you're not free to love. So it does worry me, the kind of idea that being alone is either a bit mad or deeply sad. And I know, a lot of my friends feel that, and it's a pity, really, because they're wrong. It's a pity that my clever friends should be wrong. But it's also a pity because they're wasting anxiety, because I'm very happy. But there is a kind of... I said to a very close woman friend of mine, if I'd said that I was leaving London to go and live with some sheep farmer who was immensely sexy up a hill, you'd think it was high risk, but you wouldn't think it was mad. Not in that kind of way. She's still my friend as well. It says a lot for both of us, I think. Part of what I do is just really an experiment. It's an experiment to see how possible it is to live silently. I'm going to talk very briefly about the things that interrupt that, the most difficult things for me about being silent. The thing that seems to be most difficult for most people is doing without music. And I'm really sorry that I can't be here tonight. I'm here tomorrow night to hear... What's the name of the person who's going to talk about music tomorrow night?
Fabián Panisello.
I'm not even going to risk repronouncing it. I'm sure you can get a brochure.
Fabián Panisello.
Who's going to talk about the connection between music and silence, because I think it's there. I really know it's there. But I decided that I'd try without. And that's probably the biggest difficulty. The second biggest difficulty is money. It is not very easy. It's no longer possible to live completely outside the cash economy, because if nothing else happens, the tax man happens. So even if you haven't earned any money, you've still got to pay the tax man. We have a housing tax in Britain. So it's quite hard to work out ways to work that are genuinely silent and useful. I'm lucky because of being a writer already. But even so, I find it difficult. And that is why the one bit of technology that I do have and do use is the web. It's internet, really. I couldn't do it without. I don't have any speakers or any sound on my computer, but I do use a computer. Because I have to live. But the serious interruptions, I think, are love, the distractions of friendship, and how right it is to pare those down. So I will go to my daughter's wedding in New York this summer, as I explained. But not just that, it's quite hard to know what's the right way to do that. And at the kind of level below love is what I can only describe as good manners, courtesy. You know, I am very dependent on my neighbours. They're not very close neighbours. Well, this winter, did you have a cold winter here? Well, we had the coldest, where I live, was the coldest, we had the coldest temperatures ever recorded. Mind you, they haven't been recording them in Galloway for very long. But so we had the coldest weather in 120 years. And the groundwater froze, not the water in the house, the actual wells that the water was coming out of. Special Christmas present, actually. They froze just the week before Christmas and stayed frozen for about 10 days. And every single day, one of my neighbours on his quad bike bought me 20 litres of water. He bought it for no other reason than goodwill, because I couldn't get my car up to my house. So, I mean, it was freezing cold. He didn't have, it was a long drive for him. We have these things, we call them quad bikes, which are like, which farmers use now, which are like motorbikes with 4 wheels, essentially. They're quite low and they're very, very sturdy. And you can get them places that they've never been able to get before. But it was, so in that sense, I do not think it would be civil to let someone do that and not say, hello, Gordon, thank you. There are things more important than silence in that context. And that spreads a bit more widely. We like to think of ourselves as independent, but one of the things that I've learned is how not independent I am. Somewhere miles away from me, those electricity men are making electricity. And the shop people are making food. And so I've thought a lot about how sensible it is not to say thank you and the civilities that go with thank you. And I also recognise if you live somewhere very rural, you have to look after your neighbours a bit because they look after you. So I found that quite a hard thing to balance. But the really hard thing about silence is about ego. And that's been for only 2,500 years the problem with silence, that silence confronts you hideously with just how egotistic you are. So that even when you set up kind of perfect quiet, there's still that something in your head that just goes on jabbering and jabbering and jabbering and yakking and talking and bullying and harassing and shouting, and you get bad-tempered. It's very depressing getting bad-tempered when there's nobody to tell they're an idiot to. And setting against that a kind of regular and disciplined practice of prayer, practice of silence, which is the same thing in some ways, but not in others. I spoke to a nun who I'm very fond of, who's in a silent order about this. I said, what do you do? And she said, you start by never letting yourself write a rude letter to a newspaper. And I said, what? And she said, there are 12 of us in this silent order. And 2 years ago, we discovered that we'd sent 236 letters to the Catholic press the previous year between us. We decided that wasn't very silent. But, what it is this kind of bubbling up of self. And you'd think if you were on your own, that wouldn't happen, but it does. And against those things have to be put the enormous joy and the positive joys of silence, which I think we may be in danger of losing, really, or not knowing how to use. And it was really for them that I wrote the book in the end. I just wanted to say, look, this is a fun thing to do. You don't have to do it all the time, but you do want to do it a bit. And just very quickly, I'd list some of the sort of seriously great pleasures of silence. I mean, not the little pleasures. The little pleasures about silence, if you're on your own, is that you never have to care what anyone else wants for supper, you know, and you don't have to brush your hair all the time or anything. But the big pleasures of silence are about a sense of contact, or of a growing sense of a growing contact with something that is infinitely bigger than yourself, which I call God, and that it's a positive contact. That, I mean, I've been a Christian, practicing Christian for almost all my adult life, and it wasn't until I had actually the time and the silence to do it in when I realised what a mingy little God I had. You know, my God was either always terribly cross with me about little things that I wasn't doing quite right, or terribly cross with everybody else because I wanted him to be. And having a bigger size of God is a very real pleasure. There's a very real, and to me very exciting, a sense of oneness with nature that you get, because one thing that that nature doesn't do is talk back. If you want to engage with the very, very wild and very, to me, lovely countryside I live in, you have to look a lot because it's not going to say anything. So it's kind of learning some new ways of thinking about things that are beyond yak, beyond talk. A third pleasure is the depth of relationship you get when you do talk to people. When I lived in London, I had, masses of friends. I really still have masses of friends, actually. I'm very lucky. But a lot of them, who I believe to be very close friends, I only saw with lots of other people around. I only saw at, parties or meetings or when we were doing stuff. And actually, nobody can come and see me who isn't prepared to stay at least one night, because you can't get there. And suddenly I have a much deeper sense of friendship that is nourished by the silence, actually. And the other thing is silence itself is very weird. It's endlessly fascinating, the things it does. And I think I'm going to end now by reading just a little bit from the end of the book. I was going to rabbit on, because I can rabbit on, as you may have noticed. Oh, another thing about it is if you're silent, when you stop being silent, you can't control it. But I'm going to read a little bit from the end of the book, which is perhaps a bit unfair on my poor translator, actually. Well, I won't read it, because I think that's not fair on her. You can buy the book and read it for yourself. It's on page 287. It probably isn't actually in the Spanish edition. Don't worry about it. It's right at the end, where I compare silence to a black hole. This scientific theory that there's points in space which suck in, where the point of gravity gets so intense that it sucks everything into it, even light and time. And that's the one that science fiction writers spin off on the grounds that you whip through there and arrive in a new universe. Well, I don't know about that. But there's something about the way silence intensifies, squeezes experience in a way that is very, very thrilling, actually. And obviously that doesn't happen all the time. Some of the time you just think, oh, it's so complicated and difficult and I'm bored of this. But I come back and back and back to it again, that this extraordinary feeling that I've never had from anywhere else, of being at one with myself, with my environment, with my God, and with something that's just big and that holds you. And so I wrote this book about it because I just felt it was something that we were losing touch with increasingly, that people don't know much about silence, they don't know how to use it, they're very frightened when it happens to them. And so I wrote this book, and I would just quickly say, as I stop, if you ever want to be silent, the stupidest thing in the world you can possibly do is write a book about silence, because then you have to talk about it, which I've just done. Thank you.